in our lives, in our faith, in our civil society. And today we're going to be talking about abortion and if there's a way to have a common good conversation about abortion. It's our second conversation with Ashley Abercrombie and Elisabeth Kraus. So welcome back to this conversation, sort of part two. On this podcast, we like to take an open-eyed and positive view toward what's going on in our world and what we can do about it. And so we're glad that you're along with us. I'm in Minneapolis, sitting down. The weather has broken for Minneapolis. I know a lot of you are living in parts of the country where the weather is still pounding you so aggressively. As a Minnesotan, I'll say hang in there. And I know that when you live in Texas and it's 20 degrees, that's not easy. So may you get your power back on and stay as warm as you can. So let us know in the comments here if you're on the live stream where you're listening from, because we're really glad to see you today. Good to be seen by you. And of course, good to have you hear us. So, hey, Elisabeth. Hey, Ashley. Welcome. Where do you find yourselves today?
The awkward silence. I'll go first. I am in Spokane, Washington, which is right on the border between Washington and Idaho. And it is freezing here. The whole world is frozen outside my window. But yeah, we just launched into spring quarter here at the university I teach in, and our students are bundled up, and some coming on Zoom and some coming in person and some doing lots of things. So I'm freezing and teaching and doing all the things that I love. So it's a good day.
That's awesome. And so I am joining you from Los Angeles, which, as you can see behind me, is very sunny today and beautiful. I was just telling them earlier when we were chatting that, sometimes Los Angeles people like to pretend that they're cold and wear parkas in a 65-degree winter. So I'm doing okay over here.
So we talked last week about your own stories around abortion, how you think about it, how you talk about it. It was extremely powerful. I want to thank you. And on behalf of all who listened and expressed their appreciation, I want to say that out loud. It was a very powerful time. And what a lot of people were saying in comments and in personal conversations that I had was, wow, I've never or rarely heard people talk so frankly in public about abortion like this. It's one of the more difficult topics in our society, frankly. It often gets moved just into the political space, and a lot of people think about their view of abortion in relationship to the candidates they vote for or the political party that they vote for. And while that might be an important outcome of the way we think about abortion, it sure seems like that's not the only lens and frame through which we should engage this issue. But it feels like the political situation is the one where it's safe to talk about abortion. Like, where else do you bring it up, right? Maybe in a podcast like this or in a very controlled environment. It doesn't feel like one of the conversations that's happening in our society. That's just kind of casual and natural. And there are some important ones, right? Race is being engaged by people in some whole new, fresh ways, and how we think about policing and what we want to do about Christian nationalists who bring about an insurrection to overthrow our government. Like, those are things that are also very wrought with conflict, but we're comfortable talking about them. Abortion, though, that sits in a different space. So today what we're going to be talking about with each other and with all of our listeners here is how can you talk about it, and is there a common good way to talk about it? And Ashley and Elisabeth, you are both very good at this. You've dedicated yourselves to it. You are as experienced as anyone I've ever met on this issue. So what do we need to know, and what do you know about how you talk about this issue of abortion in a way that can feel good for you, good for the person you're engaging with, whether you agree with them or disagree? Because I think a lot of us don't even know if we agree or disagree with people in our own families. My wife and I had a conversation after our podcast last week, and we were differing on some things that I didn't even know we would have thought differently about. So I think we don't always know what we think ourselves, or certainly the people closest to us in our lives, what they think about. How do you all approach it?
Great. Well, for those who might be listening in for the first time and missed our conversation last week, I want to let you know that I have had an abortion as a Christian, and I had that in my early 20s. I had just turned 21, was struggling in poverty and dealing with a whole host of issues, from addiction to drugs and alcohol, eating disorders. I mean, I was just going through absolute hell in my life when I made the decision to have an abortion. And the recovery process for that was quite difficult and long for me. And I also began, when I began to experience healing, then I began to lead recovery groups for women who are dealing with the issue of abortion, as well as addiction and many other things. So I think that for the last almost 18 years, I've been talking about this issue on a regular basis, mostly centered in the stories of women. And so I think that's a really important context. I don't mind talking about this topic, and I don't mind sharing my personal perspective about the topic, because it is exactly what Doug said and what Elisabeth shared last week. It is a harder topic for people to tackle, but it is a topic that affects, 1 in 4 women. And so that means our sisters, family members, people we go to church with, people we show up and work with, people that we are engaging in book clubs with. There are likely women that we encounter on a regular basis who have experienced an abortion personally or know someone who has. And so I think that keeping this about story is one of the ways that I personally prefer to talk about it. And it doesn't mean that I don't want to have a discussion about policy or have a discussion about how this should play out in the public space and what would be the best way to journey alongside women and wrap services around them, like paid maternity leave and affordable insurance and making sure housing's in place and all the things that are necessary to allow a mother and a baby and a family, if that's the case, to flourish. And so it's important to talk about that. So my favorite way to talk about this is through story. And I think you have to understand what is the motivation of the conversation that you're trying to have. That's the first thing that I try to discern. So whether it's an online digital conversation and somebody's posted something that's completely inaccurate on Facebook, but I feel compelled to respond to that, or it is a conversation with family members who I know might be staunch conservative Christians or conservative Catholics, then I want to have the conversation knowing what the motivation might be for some of the beliefs or some of the ideas about abortion. Or is this a woman who might be opening up to me about the fact that she has had an abortion but feels guilty and unable to share that in her life? So one of the first things I try to do is center story. And the next thing I want to do is discern what is the motivation of this conversation, because that can help me engage with people in a way that they can not only understand the issue, but also that I can still center story and still center the lives of women in the conversation and the dialogue. So that's kind of where I begin.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Ashley, you just say everything so perfectly. I have so little to add to that. Yeah, so I'm so excited to be here again. Doug, thank you for having this conversation, because it is one that's it's so hard to find a group who will talk about it. My experience, as I mentioned last week, was a little bit different than Ashley's, but I too have had an abortion. In fact, I've had 2, and both of them were late term, well into my second trimester abortions, of very wanted babies who came from a context where everyone would deem acceptable. In other words, I was the good evangelical who got married and went to graduate school and started my career and then decided to have babies. And in my mind, I struggled for a really long time with this notion of, hey, but I did everything right, so why did everything go so wrong? And thank God for my therapist and good people around me, and a long, faithful process of deconstructing my own faith and deciding where I stood in relation to a lot of things. But I think the only thing I would really add to what Ashley said so beautifully is that one of the filters that I try to look through in these conversations is one that Brene Brown put in place of helping us to understand the difference between guilt and between shame. Guilt being, hey, I feel like I did something bad, and shame being, hey, I feel like I am something bad as a result of what I've endured or what I've gone through. And I think that women who have had abortions often struggle with the latter of those, where this is such a stigmatized topic, such a misunderstood action, that it's so easy to translate this decision into, because I made this decision, I am innately bad. I am innately broken. I've committed some horrible sin. And that can be confusing for women, especially who look back and say, I don't know that I regret this decision. This was the best decision I could have made in that time. And I'm not sure what that says about me as a person. And I think that struggle comes from the way that we have this conversation in faith contexts, where we use words and language that are very loaded and very confusing and very inaccurate. We use words when we talk about abortion, like Holocaust and murder and all of these kind of crazy labels and titles that create so much stigma around this particular act. And so I think that where I would hope for these conversations to go is I hope to protect them from devolving into you did something bad or you are a murderer, right? We slap really, really terrible titles on these women. And so I think that understanding and conversation and sometimes not talking, just listening to people's stories helps us to undo a little bit of that guilt narrative and a little bit of that shame narrative. So part of my motivation for telling my stories is I want to stand in a very lighted place and invite women out of dark places, out of those, I have to hide this, I can't tell my husband, I can't tell my family, I can't tell my church. And I want to invite them into lighted spaces where it's safe to say, this is the decision that I made, and not to ever feel that they have to stand as, as if they're on trial and defend that decision. So I just want to bring understanding and light to what is a really complicated conversation. So I'm really thankful to be here and thankful to have this conversation with you too, because this is so refreshing for me.
Well, thanks to both of you. How do you bring it up? Like, how do you start talking about this issue with people? Like, obviously, if someone raises it with you, or if they indicate something in a public way, on a social media platform or something, but it feels like if we just wait for those paths to come open and we don't initiate these conversations, people tend to stay rooted in whatever version of thinking that they had, right? And this is one of the things I've realized as a pastor of adults, is that people are stuck with childhood versions of a lot of stories in their lives, right? About their faith, about moral issues, until they've addressed them again as an adult. So if someone hasn't had experience with an abortion, they may not have had to come to the realization that both of you did as adults and people in your circles. So they often are thinking about it in ways that are very similar to how they first thought about it at a much younger age, right? And now they're having to approach it again as an adult, and they don't know how. So how can we broach this subject with one another so that we can open up, as you put it so well, Elisabeth, so we can open up shine the light on this issue and engage with it. Do you have any thoughts on that, initiating it with people who don't already have a reason to be talking about it?
Yeah, I think that, again, I think that there are a couple of ways you can engage this issue. And even for women who have had abortions, it is so rare to find someone who's willing to talk about it because it is so personal. And it is so painful. I've never met a woman who, despite what you might see on the news, I've never met a woman who celebrated her abortion. And I have worked with hundreds and hundreds of women, and I've never once met a female who celebrated this issue. So, it's difficult to find someone who's willing to share and willing to talk about it. And so I think it's good to bring it up in the context of, hey, here's something that I've been thinking about, and I might need a little grace to talk about this issue because it does feel so polarizing. And as soon as I say it, I don't know what you're going to think. I don't know if you're going to shut down. I don't know if it's going to feel a little scary because it feels like a lot of conflict and tension could be in that dialogue, but it is something I want to talk about. Would you be open to talking to me about the issue of abortion? I'm learning more and I want to know exactly where I stand, and I'm trying to figure out how to care for women in my world. And I'd love to talk to you about this issue, because I think part of the reason we shut down on conversations is because we are, one, terrified of conflict, and two, we are so afraid we're going to say something wrong. And so because we're so scared that we're going to say something wrong, then we don't engage in the conversation. We shut down and we feel afraid and we get scared because we think we have to do it perfectly to engage. But you don't have to do everything right to talk about a hard topic. You can just say, this is a hard topic. It's hard for me to talk about, and I want to talk about it. So here goes. And again, you want to start with with safe people. Start in a context where you won't be shamed. Start in a context where it's not going to immediately escalate to politics or baby murderers or all those things. Like, start in a safe place, because once you kind of work out that dialogue in a safe place, then you'll begin to grow more comfortable having that dialogue in spaces where it might not feel so safe. And so it's much better to start with people that you know, people that you love, people in a small group. That's an important place to start. And then I would also encourage you that if the other person has a strong visceral reaction, it's okay. Part of having good boundaries is knowing where you end and another person begins. And so we don't have to, feel like, man, they had a very visceral reaction to this. Is this wrong? Is this bad? Did I do something wrong? No, it's okay for somebody to have a strong reaction, and that doesn't mean anything's wrong with you.
Boy, that's
Right.
that's a really important note. Thank you for that. That is a powerfully important part of this conversation.
Yeah, man, you just say it so good, so well. I think that the reality is that we've turned this into a political issue that happens 4 times, every 4 years, when this is something that happens in women's lives every single day. And I think for me, often the jumping point for starting a conversation, I find that just because I've told my story so publicly, that women who end up having abortions kind of come and find me. And I'm really thankful for that. I love being a safe place to land. I love being a safe place to say, I hear you. That sounds painful. How can I be in pain with you? I've been there. I'm not even trying to lead you out. I'm not trying to fix it. I just want to be with you in that pain. And I think that that's really, really important, that empathy that just says, hey, I don't need to fix your decision. I don't need to direct you in the right path. I can just be with you. And I can be with you even if I have not settled on what I feel about this.
Yeah.
I think it is okay to come to the table, to have this conversation, to come with really strong opinions, and then to say, to hear a story like mine, or to hear a story like Ashley's, and then to go, okay, well, now I'm not sure. Now I don't know what I think. And I think our conversation lacks the willingness to just say, I don't know. I don't know what I think about that. I need to sit with that for a while. I need to just process this a little bit. I've been pro-life my whole life, and yet I think I would have done the same thing that you did. And I just need to sit with what that means for a minute. And I think both sides need to allow a lot of space for, I don't know. I think it's unrealistic for us to ask people who, believe very firmly one way to make a jump overnight. That's cognitive dissonance at its finest, right? Where it's really hard to embrace a polar opposite when you've lived in light. You feel like it's hard to embrace what feels dark. And I just want to say that that's okay. I want to be a person where you can come to me and say, I don't know if I ever would have made the decision that you made, but I want to understand it better. Can you tell me more about it? And I want to try and listen better. So I want to understand it. And I think our conversation needs that. Needs to feature most prominently, hey, this is a safe place to say you're not sure. Or this is a safe place to say, I feel really strongly one way. But I'll try and listen. I'll try and understand your perspective, even if at the end of the day, we don't land at the same conclusion. So I think that that's really, really an important feature. I have this conversation a lot. South Carolina their legislation passed some anti-abortion stuff just yesterday. It was reported. And I find that those are really interesting spots to start this conversation with people who think that abortion doesn't impact their lives. People who think, Doug, you referenced someone last week who'd been working in pro-life activism for forever and said he had never met a woman who had an abortion. And I think when you told me that the first time, I laughed because I was like, yes, you have.
Right.
You've met, 1 in 4 of the women you've met have had an abortion. They're just too scared to tell you. And that says something more about him than it does about those women. And so I think it's okay to say, hey, this is happening in our world. What do we think of this? what do we think of legislation that says these things? And, I always put, especially when we do it on social media, I always put the caveat, hey, be nice to each other, or be nice or get blocked. But I think it's okay to just, we get too scared of fighting with each other, and too scared to say we don't know, and too scared of, the potential conflict, that we have lost the ability to have a conversation that extends grace and love and disagreement at the same time. And I want to bring that back. Hey, what does it mean that South Carolina passed this legislation? What do we think of legislation like this? And then ask questions and listen to their answers and look for words that signal their ethic, because I think a lot of people have an ethic that values life. They just don't always communicate it very well. And that's okay.
Right.
So how do we
Elisabeth,
make
as
space?
best as you can explain it, what did South Carolina do legislatively, and how should people, what should they know about it?
Yeah, I think the first thing that we should know is that legislation that gets passed at a state level is often passed just to provoke a fight in the Supreme Court. I think we need to know that. It's really easy to look at legislation, and I need to read a little bit more about what happened in South Carolina, but we see these kinds of bills all the time, like heartbeat bills, for example. The minute we can detect a heartbeat, we want to prohibit women from having an abortion. And that so far, all of those have been overturned. And I think that that's rightly so. I'm not sure that I could list super accurately all the nuances of that legislation, because I just saw the report on it yesterday. But I think that we all need to come into these discussions recognizing that this is something that where conservative politicians are trying to bring the fight to the Supreme Court. And they're trying to bring the fight there because now we have a very heavily weighted Supreme Court, right? And the ultimate hope being, what can we do to Roe? Well, Roe has been upheld, I think Ashley pointed this out last week, even by conservative judges for a really long time. I am probably more nervous about it given the makeup of our court right now, but I'm not sure that I think Roe is going to disappear. And I think that that's a good thing, because I think woe unto us if we go back to the days of hangers in back alleys. Mm-hmm. And those days were real, and a lot of women died. And I think that that's not a merciful society I want to be a part of. So more than anything, when you see these headlines, you need to just know right off the bat, okay, they're trying to get this pushed to the Supreme Court. They're trying to pick a fight. And that often those are political maneuvers. They are not actual genuine legislation with any ethic attached to them. They're trying to pick a political fight. And we don't need to engage in a political fight, because this is not just politics. This is women's lives. So whenever you see these headlines, regardless of what gets voted on, I would encourage everybody to take a giant step back and say, hey, I'm not going to engage in a Republican versus Democrat fight here. What I am going to look at is the ethic. What does it look like? What would it look like to live in a society that values what this legislation just passed? And if I don't value that at a core ethical level, then what does that mean for me? What does that mean for how I vote? What does that mean for how I speak? What does that mean for how I label people? And so I tend to sort of dismiss the actual legislation, but pay particular attention to the language and the way that we talk about that legislation, because that tells us the most.
And I also think the faith community lacks a great deal of integrity when it comes to policy. And part of that is lack of education, believing memes on Facebook, inheriting rhetoric and perpetuating it instead of actually offering yourself a thoughtful critique about what you think and believe. We need to do better at thinking critically, but we lack integrity, because if we really did believe in pro-life, if we really said, you know what, I want to live in a society where abortion is unnecessary, okay? Because that sounds much better than I'm anti-abortion. If we were going to make the issue of abortion unnecessary, what would that look like? Well, we have to recognize in some cases, like what Elisabeth went through, it is not possible. And we have got to leave room and space and grace for that. And then also we have got to go, hey, I can't pass this sweeping legislation and have integrity in my pro-life ethic if I do not also want to figure out, why do women pursue this this direction as someone like me? Why is poverty a factor? Which that is the through line of people who have abortions. And what are we doing about poverty? And then what about addiction? What about mental health? What about disability? I mean, the list goes on and on and on for women. And so if we really are, and then where are the men, which I brought up last week? If we are going to continue to make this stigma and go anti-abortion for women and penalize bodies and criminalize women, then what does that look like for us to say, you know, where is the man in this conversation? Why is he not being held accountable for what he does with his body? And I'm telling you, I've not seen such a lack of integrity in the faith community. We cannot just, you know, decide what women ought to do with their bodies and let them, you know, say things like, you know, well, if women aren't ready to have babies, they shouldn't be having sex. Well, what about men who are having sex, their bodies, who also make babies? And we put all of the onus on women, and it's unacceptable. And if we can't have affordable housing, if we cannot have health care, if it costs women, as I pointed out last week, anywhere from $500 to $28,000 to have a baby, then what does that say about our pro-life ethics? Okay. Does that mean only rich people should have babies and get pregnant? What does that mean? And so we, as a Christian community, we need to grow in nuance and integrity. And as Elisabeth so beautifully pointed out, humility. We need to come to this more humble than we are. We don't know what's happening in legislation in 50 states. We are not educated on the issue of abortion for the visceral way we talk about it. And so it's important for us to restore integrity to our faith and policy discussions.
Yeah.
So
and
I want to bring
Ashley,
up. Go ahead.
No, even Ashley and I, who've gone through what we have gone through, I think both of us would sit down with any single person who came to us with good intention to have a conversation. And even with our experiences would say, we don't know everything. Yes. There's things we haven't thought about. There are issues and perspectives that we haven't considered. But I would sit down with any person of any gender, of any background and any belief system who had a genuine desire to have conversation. In other words, I'm going to listen to you and try to understand you, and I will listen to them and try to understand them. And we can come to disagreement in grace and love and common good. That's the thing. There is common good between both polar opposites. And the common good is, at the end of the day, we all want to live in a culture where abortion isn't necessary as much as possible, where poverty doesn't dictate abortion, where marital status and violence and location and socioeconomics, all those things are not determining factors, where the only factor to consider is safety and health and dignity. I want that society. As a staunchly pro-choice woman, I want that society. And I think that Ashley, you said it perfectly. Coming to the table with humility, that on all sides, none of us know it all. None of us have capitalized truth here. We all want the best, and the common good is we all want a space where human life matters and is valued. So how do we make that world? We can do it. We just have to come to the table first.
So I'm going to throw in a couple of questions from people that are on Facebook. Don writes, thanks so much for this conversation. As a pastor in a progressive church, this is such a difficult topic to address. And I want to use that to sort of open another conversation that's happening in the string of people that are commenting online here. It very quickly is the Bible invoked in conversations about abortion? It happens quickly, right? Someone will often say, the Bible doesn't explicitly address abortion, and then somebody else will say it does address abortion in these other passages, and all of a sudden we're now inside of a biblical interpretation moment, and then someone starts talking about the law, and they start talking about who has agency and where a baby is located, and now we're talking about constitutional law, and so very quickly people find themselves out of their depth. Right? They say, I don't know that I know the New Testament and Old Testament categories and context and ethics, and I certainly don't know all the legal aspects of the Constitution and how laws are interpreted. So I don't want to talk about the Bible, and I don't want to talk about the law, and yet these are all in the mix. So can you just say a little bit about this? Like, how do people, what do you say to people who feel like, wow, as soon as we get into this and move anywhere outside of personal story, right, I feel like, oh boy, this is going to go somewhere that that I don't want to go. And I'm not talking about the people who don't want to have their minds changed, right? That's another conversation, right? A lot of people don't want to, they only want to be in a yes conversation. Yes, I agree with you. Or no conversation. No, I disagree with you. They don't want to be in an uh-oh conversation, which is, uh-oh, now I don't know what I think, right? And so we spend a lot of our time making sure we stay out of uh-oh conversations and in yes and no conversations. So I'm not talking about those people. I'm saying the people who do want to talk about this, but they're just like, well, wow, it's going to come to the Bible. It's going to come to law. I don't know how to think about it.
I think if it's okay to jump in, I think when we say that the Bible doesn't talk about it, what we're really saying is that the Bible doesn't really give us a black and white about it, because it does talk about when a baby dies in the womb. So for example, in the Old Testament, the law kind of articulates, if someone comes and attacks a pregnant woman and it results in the death of the child she was carrying, that's ultimately treated as a civil matter. They have to compensate that woman. But if it results in the death of the woman, it's treated as a criminal matter in the Old Testament law. So there is a little bit of discussion in the Old Testament about what it means for a child to die inside the womb at the hand of an adult. It doesn't necessarily black and white deal with abortion, but it does talk about those things. And we have to, in essence, take hints from what we think was happening and what we think the intention was. And we have to recognize that when we're dealing with any topic in Scripture, it's really easy to find what you're looking for. It's really, really hard to find what's there. And that's true in kind of all of literature, which is, that's what I teach at the university. But when we say, well, the Bible doesn't talk about it, I think what we're more saying is it's very scary to me that the Bible doesn't spell this out black and white. And now I'm worried I'm going to get it wrong. So we preface these conversations even in churches. When I speak in churches with, hey, the reality is we're taking our best guess here. And here's what we can look at. Here are the hints that Scripture gives us. Here's the things that they value. But I think it comes back again to being able to say, when we are afraid of those uh-oh conversations, we're afraid of them because we're all afraid to say, uh-oh, I don't know. And if we can just come to a space where it's just okay to say, hey, I'm not sure about that Scripture. That's something I need to go look up and study. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm gonna process that a little bit. Or, I don't know the nuances of the law. Gosh, I thought that it was legal for someone to have an abortion at 40 weeks pregnant. And then now I'm finding out it's not. And maybe that changes my perspective, and I need to sit with that for a minute. We are afraid of uh-oh conversations because we're afraid to say uh-oh. And I think maybe if leaders, pastors in particular, male pastors in particular, if you can stand up and say, I don't know about this. I'm trying really hard to get my head around it. So in humility, one, I'm going to pass the microphone to a woman who does know about this and who has experienced this and lived this, and walk away from the table saying, I have some things to think about and things to process, and we're going to come back in small groups and talk about this further. We're going to make space for these stories and for these conversations to happen. We just need to be less afraid that we don't know and more willing to just say we don't know, I think.
That's really beautiful. And I also would love to chime in here, because I think in the case of a human being like me, with my finite mind, trying to interpret what an infinite God believes, I don't know. And so I lean into mercy and I lean into love. And when I think about, my connection with, myself and my own experience with abortion, in terminating a pregnancy, losing a baby in that way, I think to myself, I think that it grieved the heart of God that I made the decision to terminate a pregnancy of a live baby. And now that I have 3 of them, I know exactly where they were in the womb. I know exactly what was happening with them. And I think, I sense God's heart for me and for that situation and for the baby. And so I think that it's important to recognize not all women feel that way, but that is true for me. I was deeply grieved about the decision that I made. And but I'm unsure if I can say this, if it's okay for me to say this, but I'm unsure if I regret the decision, because I know what it would have meant for me in that dysfunctional relationship, living in the town that I was living in as a woman in poverty. What would that have meant for me? And so I'm sharing with you honestly and vulnerably, because I think that's important to this. And I know many women who are in domestic violence situations who don't regret the decision that they had, that they made to terminate their pregnancy. Because Elisabeth and I do have different stories, and I did not experience compassionate care at the abortion clinic. I did not experience, a lot of tenderness and mercy. It was a quick procedure. It was one and done. They lined all of us up at the end of it to put us in recovery. I mean, it was a difficult situation. And so I think it's important, when I think about God, I think about his mercy. And one of the things that people have said to me is, well, the Bible is very clear about abortion because it says, thou shalt not kill. And so I'm bringing that up because I get that the most from Christians and from believers, even from people who, as we pointed out, do actually want to change. Obviously you're going to get that from people who have no desire to listen or to change. But I have gotten that from people who have a deep burning desire to understand, to change, who love women, who want to see them healed and whole. And so thou shalt not kill is the one that I get. And I think that we do have to interpret scripture with other scripture. And so we look at the life of Jesus and how he dealt with women in pain and how he dealt with people in pain. And, Jesus came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law, because he knew that we couldn't do it. He knew that we could not fulfill the law. And then I think about the woman who was caught in adultery, and how he turned to that group of men and basically said, if you haven't sinned, throw the first stone. And none of them could do it. They laid down their stones. And so I think, when we are talking about pulling out that one commandment, thou shalt not kill, then, well, have you ever coveted your neighbor? Have you personally committed adultery in your mind, even? Because Jesus talks about that as well. He went even further than the actual action and told them, if you even lust in your heart, you have committed adultery. If you are even angry at another person, at a neighbor, you have committed murder. And so I feel like Jesus just takes it to this place that's deeply rooted in our heart. And we want that black and white idea of like, here's the action that happened, here's the punishment that happens. And we have to remember Jesus came to set us free. And he came to exemplify the merciful heart of God. And he came to say, yes, you may have done something that you deeply regret or something that felt so painful to you, but here's how I'm going to set you free. And here's how I free you from condemnation. And so I think, we need to return to mercy. And we need to, as we've all pointed out here today, understand that we don't know everything. And you don't know everything about a person who's making a very difficult decision. And sometimes the best thing to do is to be quiet.
Well, I just want to know, Ashley, how brave that is to share that. Thank you for that. And your comments earlier where you said, I grieve deeply the terminating of this pregnancy, and I understand it now in a way that I didn't. I would imagine that when you say something like that, some people start to get really nervous, right? They're like, oh boy, I don't want to hear someone condemning women, and I don't know where she's going with this. And then I could imagine other people would start to say, yeah, see, it's you grieve, so there was something wrong. And then you pivot in this way to say, but I don't regret. Grief and regret are different things. I knew I had to do something difficult. And then those same people will chime in and say, well, how could you not regret it if you grieve? And it's that complexity, which I think is such a gift for this conversation. And I know, Elisabeth, you've said many of the same things because you had a medical crisis with your little ones that caused the needing to terminate the pregnancy. So that owning and sharing and holding both of those is what in my view, in the rules of talking about abortion, breaks the rules. Yeah, people want you to be on one side or they want you to be on the other, and you don't get to give hint toward that other side at all. Do you find that, both of you, either of you, do you find the same thing where it feels like there's a very defined set of rules of how we're going to talk about this and what can be said and what's not said? And I know, Ashley, you were careful to even say, look, I'm just being authentic and vulnerable here, which is one of the things we do in our society where we're like, okay, everybody be careful, treat me with goodness and kindness here, right? So it feels like that's such a big piece of this, is not only do we not know how to talk about it? We literally don't know if it's safe to say these things to other people, or how we're going to frame it. And are you intentionally framing yourself in this way that brings both of those together?
Yes, I am. I think that, and again, we want to make this a political issue and a black and white issue. And the truth is, how can you do that with story? How can you do that with a life? It's why even though I don't always understand everything about the gospel, I'm so attracted to Jesus, because you just could not put him in a camp. And I want to live like that. I don't want to be the kind of person that you can peg in a left hole or a right hole or whatever. Like this is, for me, is not what it's about. But I care deeply about policy. I am active and engaged in a local and state and federal level. So let me say that clearly. I believe in Christians being actively engaged as civic citizens. And at the same time, I want people to understand that there's so much more to this, and that we don't fully understand biblically what is happening around this issue, and that we don't understand what's happening with women. And so we need to be framing this, in a way that opens the dialogue up for people on all sides. And that's part of the problem, is that Christians want us to be right or left. It's so gross. It's gross to me, this enmeshment of faith and politics. It's something I feel so very frustrated about and so very passionate about. And my policies, you can't put me personally on any issue in one peg or the other. And I like living that way. And I think it is more in the way of Jesus than doubling down in pride. Peter Enns wrote this amazing book called The Sin of Certainty. Man, and that book blessed me so much, because I realized in the way I had been raised, there was so much that I felt certain about. And until my experiences began, man, I really realized there's so much I don't know. And there's so many things I'm uncertain about. And that's okay. There's not a place in the Bible that says you have to be right about everything in order for the Lord to, welcome you. In fact, it says that the Lord resists the proud, that he is opposed to pride. In fact, in the Proverbs, it's listed 6 things, and the 7 things that God hates. And one of those things is pride. And so I think that it's really important for us to humble ourselves on this, and to know, it needs to be framed in a way that is not black or white, right or left, but hey, this is the whole truth as I've experienced it, and this is the whole truth as I've seen it.
Wow.
And you might come to a different, welcome to working during COVID, ladies.
Yes, for those listening, we've now been joined by a sweet little face on the screen. So, hello.
Sorry. Anyways, I think that you also might answer the abortion question differently depending on the situation. And that is something that is really complicated. I'm one of those people who hears, I was listening to Ashley a minute ago, and I kind of held my breath, because I thought, does she think I'm a sinner? Right? Like, just, and the reality is, we listen to other people's stories and assume that they're judgments about us. That's our first instinct, is to go, walls up, don't judge me. You can't know my situation. You don't, and that's what starts the conflict, is that we think it's a judgment right about us. And it really isn't.
Right.
The fact that I can take a minute and just sit down and go, okay, that's her experience, and she gets to own that story in her own beautiful, vulnerable way. And I can honor that experience and recognize my experience was different, and that maybe our answers on what I would do are going to be different depending on the life that we live and the situation that we have. This conversation can lack nuance in so many ways, and we get polarized. I think that Jesus knows, God knows, how scary it is to be us. How scary it would be for a woman in abject poverty living through a domestic violence situation to find herself pregnant, and then to say, I don't have any options here. I think that God's mercy is in that moment. I think God is with her in that clinic. I think that God holds her hand and loves her and values her and recognizes it is scary to be alive in that situation. And I think that God's mercy trumps everything else. And it is okay for us to listen and allow people the freedom to live their experience and the freedom to experience God's mercy and grace, and to recognize that God's mercy and grace may look different in my life, but that doesn't mean it's any less present or any less beautiful. And Ashley and I can come together having had really different experiences, but the same value, which is that we are both made in God's image. God knew how scary it was to live through what we lived through. God was was with us in every single moment. God protected us. God valued us. God placed value within us. The divine within her can connect with the divine within me, and there's commonality in that situation. And so the defensiveness that can come up in you, I would just encourage, whether this is something you've experienced or something you haven't, and something you have really strong opinions on, the minute that defensiveness rises, take a breath and come back to what is common. And what's common is the humanity and the divinity within all people. And we can land there. We can find conversation in that space.
I'm giving you snaps.
Can I take us in one fresh direction here? And we didn't talk about this at all ahead of time, so I know it could seem as a bit of a surprise. Try to think about this, but it's dawning on me that most important issues that we talk about, we put them into a cluster with other similar issues in our own minds.
Right.
So we sort of, as human beings, we're very good at organizing and categorizing, and some of us do it much more precisely, and some of us do it much more fun way of making word clouds in our thinking of what goes together. You both have mentioned, when we've talked about abortion these last 2 weeks, you bring up things like housing and healthcare and finances. Other people cluster in with abortion, morality and killing and a judgment of a society that's going to care for the most vulnerable, right? So, I think part of what influences how we think about any significant topic is, what are the partner concepts and ideas that we put together when we think about those. And part of what opens up our experiences when we meet somebody who talks about a topic that we've thought about, and they start talking about other partnering ideas, like they describe the characters that are playing with that idea, and you're like, wow, I hadn't thought about those ideas in relationship to this idea. That's intriguing, right? This is one of the things that happens. Birth control feels like it's one of those things that you wonder where it fits. And I hear a lot of people bring it up, and then a lot of people don't. And I don't mean women using abortion as birth control. I mean people saying to those who want to restrict abortions, and normally saying it to people who want to restrict it in all settings, are you also against birth control? Because there's a lot of people, many influenced by Catholic theology, not all of them, and not all Catholic theology goes to this extreme, but people who are like, you don't let women have birth control, you won't let their company pay for it, you don't want it to be in public insurance plans, and then you also, like, you're really pushing for people to make babies here, aren't you? Which is a different thing. And then other people that say, why aren't people who can become pregnant using birth control? Like, why isn't that more available? So in just a few minutes left, like, where does birth control fit in this conversation around abortion?
All right. I'm just going to level. I think that the question
here we go.
Here we go. We'll get really deep. 10 minutes left. I think the question about whether people are okay with birth control or not has less to do with abortion and more to do with sexuality. In other words, I don't want to give women birth control because I don't want to give them permission to have sex until I think they should. And I just want to take a giant step back from that and say, it's really not your decision. Nor do you have the moral, capitalism on the morality of when this is okay and when it's not, and when it's allowed and when it's not. Because the simple reality is that a lot of married women need abortion too. And most people would argue that sex within marriage is permissible and sex outside is not. And I would say that the debate on whether women should use birth control or not stems down to whether or not we think that they should be having sex or not. And I think that is a largely patriarchal idea, where I think that's the one discussion that men should not be able to insert themselves into, as to when should women, quote unquote, be allowed to have sex and when they shouldn't. The reality is access to birth control has measurable impacts on the number of abortions. We saw that in Colorado when they did kind of a social experiment. They made birth control free and available to women. I think it was all the way from 16 to 26, and they saw almost a 50% reduction in the number of abortions happening in that state.
Wow.
Okay. And then they got rid of the program because they worried that, well, maybe birth control can kind of act like an abortion and we don't want to do that. And it just drives me insane where I hear, largely male politicians saying, well, we don't want abortions. But then they get rid of programs like access to birth control that actively do what they say they're trying to do. And so I would say that, the whole discussion on when sexuality impacts this a lot, but shouldn't, thank God for birth control. Thank God for birth control for women like me, who I should not get pregnant again. That would endanger my life. And it doesn't matter. I should have the ability to protect myself. Birth control being used for things that are not pregnancy related, like healthcare and, treatment for disease and illness and whatnot. So I think birth control is an incredibly amazing gift to our society, to women. I think restricting access to it is based largely out of fear and control, and the notion that we should tell women when things are okay for them and when they're not. And it comes down to the distrust of women and the notion that, the church and those structures should be able to control a woman's sexuality and sexual expression. And that's a whole, that's a big pile of grossness that we probably don't need to unpack right now. But I do think, if you say that you want to limit the number of abortions, then you can't in the same breath tell me that we need to get rid of birth control too, because those are opposite ideas. And that makes me think that you're more invested in controlling a woman's sexual expression than you are actually in impacting the need for abortion. That's just my very honest take on that.
Well, thank you for it. Thank you.
I appreciate that so much. And not growing up evangelical, this has always seemed so odd to me that evangelicals are so against sex education and against birth control. And in fact, most of the politicians who are loud on this issue happen to be Christian or evangelical. And so it's baffling to me. I mean, I grew up having sex education. I remember in the 7th grade, we had a teacher and it was an hour long for a set of weeks. And they taught us how to use condoms and how to access birth control. And why wouldn't they? I mean, and here's the reason. Some people are like, oh, it's too young. Well, that's you trying to legislate your morality and your faith onto others. But the truth is many children are growing up in households that they do not talk about sex and they do not talk about sex education. Many children, in fact, 1 in 6 young women and 1 in 4 boys 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 boys, there it is, have been sexually abused. And so their bodies are awakened to sexuality in a way that could lead to them having more sex as they grow older. And in fact, in younger stages than those who have not been sexually abused. And so why would we not want to create opportunities for them to learn? Why would we not want more opportunities for children to be able to report if something is happening at home, because they are receiving the education they need to be able to understand this? Why would we not want women to have access to birth control? I mean, this just makes sense to me. And if men are going to not wear condoms, which tends to happen, in fact, here in California, we just passed a law where if a man removes a condom during sex, he can actually be held liable for rape. And so I think that there's so much of this conversation around consent, what happens and where are the men and why are we doing this to women and why are evangelicals trying to do this to our whole society? And so again, not growing up evangelical, but being a full throttle Jesus lover, none of this makes sense to me. And so I do think that control is important and necessary and should be part of, insurance plans, because it is expensive. And, women who are in poverty need access to this and can't trust that their partner will always wear a condom. And that's not just women in poverty, that's women in general. We have to very often convince a sexual partner to wear a condom. And if they won't, then the full throttle option of pregnancy even happening lies again on the woman. So I think that this conversation is so important, Doug, and I'm really glad that you brought it up. And again, we need access to birth control, and there should not be a stage or age where children and teenagers and adults are not able to talk about sex in a way that leads to more health and wholeness and consent. This is all very important. And without dialogues, then we don't get to have a society where we have a healthy sexual ethic. And isn't that what Christians would want? But the truth is they don't want that. And that is heartbreaking. You want a world to do what you want them to do without educating them on how to do it. Are you kidding?
Right. Yes. And it comes back to consent. Sex ed doesn't doesn't teach kids how to have sex. It teaches kids how to be autonomous with their bodies. We want girls to know that their yes means yes and their no means no. And I want boys to know that the girls' yes means yes and their no means no. And so when we talk about these things, it comes down to autonomy and the fact that I want to empower my 3 daughters to know that they are in charge of what happens to their body. They get to say no to someone who wants to touch it. They get to say yes when they're ready to say yes. They don't have to be pressured into anything. They get to choose the medical procedures that they choose, or in consultation with their doctors, that are good for them. And so this, I really do think this whole conversation comes back to consent and autonomy, and all of those things should be valued. They are valued at the heart of God. God made women to be autonomous and to be empowered over their own bodies. And so they should be valued to us and to our authority structures as well, whatever those are.
Agreed. And just one quick thing I want to add to that, because Elisabeth, that's actually the reason that the conservative judges, when they passed Roe v. Wade, that is the reason. Like if you read the write-up of why they passed it, that's why, is because they did not want anybody else to make a decision except for a woman and her doctor. They did not want the government telling women what to do in a doctor medical setting. And so that's important. That's why conservatives judges anyway, tend to keep overturning things that would go against that, because then we are giving the government a right to a woman's body. And so I appreciate this conversation. And
me too.
Well, it certainly got animated there when we started talking about the larger issues. Which tells me there's a third episode around a healthy sexual ethic in our future.
Yes.
Because look, as a society, that's probably the furthest thing from, coming around the corner, is that we're going to have a healthy sexual ethic. And I do think we've tapped into something, partly why people don't want to talk about abortion. There are the reasons they're concerned themselves. They don't know where they are ethically or morally. But as we brought up, it starts leading into these other issues. It is a slippery slope, as people often are nervous about, where now you're going to start talking about sexuality, and then you're going to start talking about patriarchy and who gets to tell women how they're supposed to live in our society, and where do parents' roles begin and end in another person's life. And then you're going to start talking about finances and the impact of a version of capitalism that doesn't care for equal spread. So all of a sudden now you're off on these other things. And when this happens, and I haven't followed all the chat, but I'm sure it will, someone will say, why every time when we start talking about abortion does it lead to all these other things, right? People that are fixated on the issue of, criminalizing abortion or making sure it stays accessible to people, they're driven, frustrated by the idea that people start pivoting into these other conversations, right? But that tells me that it's at the heart of it's an important issue in the heart of our lives, is that we start to see that there's all these little tributaries off of this same river that we need to be addressing, because all of those tributaries are feeding this river, and we need to understand that this is not a single issue, which is why when people say, well, I'm just a single issue voter, just to be very kind to them and say, of course, you don't need to be. I mean, you can just say this issue matters to me more than some others, but it's not very helpful and honest to yourself to say you're a single issue voter, because of course no one is a single issue voter. And if you are, think about it for a little while, because you probably won't stay a single issue voter. It'll quickly lead into other things. Well, either of you, Ashley, Elisabeth, you want last word on anything? Anything finally you want to say to wrap up our little 2-part series here?
I just want to say thank you. Thank you for those who have engaged in this conversation, for being brave, and for whatever you make the decision to do next. I hope that your heart and your mind have been opened in a way that would cultivate honor in the conversations that you're having, and give you an opportunity to invite more nuance around this discussion. So I'm just so thankful that you're here.
Yes. And if you, any person who wants the conversation to continue, reach out. Doug knows how to get a hold of us. You can try and find us. I know I won't speak for Ashley, but I'm here for this conversation for the long haul. So reach out and we can have a conversation in grace and love and mutual understanding that what matters most is that you are valued and made in the image of God, and so am I, and we can come to the table on that common platform.
And we'll put contact information in the show notes for the podcast. And,
Sure.
People on Facebook can see it there, and Twitter and all the other places. Hey, a little programming note. Next week, a pre-recorded conversation with Eliza Griswold. Eliza writes for The New Yorker. She spent time writing about abortion and about abortion clinics in Terre Haute, Indiana. And we had a fantastic conversation yesterday about this. And you're going to get to hear as sort of the third piece to this abortion segment. And you find all of this over at votecommongood.com/podcast. If you don't already have a podcast location for this, if you're watching only on Facebook, please subscribe to our podcast. It really means a lot. And if you're a podcast listener, hit us up over on YouTube and the other places as we build this community of people that are engaging and participating together. All of you that have been commenting on the Facebook feeds and Twitter feeds and Twitch feed and all the other places, we really do appreciate it and glad to have you all around. Tomorrow we talk science. This is a daily podcast, so every day has its own focus. On Thursdays it's issues. Friday it's science. We have astrophysicist Paul Wallace, who's our every other week co-host. On Mondays we do a roundup of the news. Tuesdays we talk common good politics. And on Wednesdays, it's Common Good Faith with Stephanie Spalding, Laura Truax, and Dominique Gilliard and myself. So a lot goes on these streams. We'd love for you to be part of it. Head over to Vote Common Good. Don't miss our In for 10 moment. We're inviting people to be in with us. And if you could be in for $10 a month, that changes our lives dramatically. So consider something like that. And thanks for being a part of this. Ashley, Elisabeth, thank you so much for your friendship, for your graciousness. And I'll just note, you didn't need to brag about this yourself, so I will. You're both mothers of young children that at 8 o'clock in the morning where you each live, you had to put at bay while schooling and homeschooling to stay away from you to talk to us for an hour each of these last 2 Thursdays. And I deeply, deeply appreciate it. And please thank your children for us too, because it means a lot to us. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.